Trump has said China needs to pay for the coronavirus. And there's one creative way the U.S. could make China pay. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. A lot of Americans who don't have crippling student loan debt are looking for new ways to invest their savings. The interest rate on government bonds here in America is basically zero. But don't worry, because investment firms that I trust, like BlackRock, are encouraging us to invest in Chinese government bonds. We know China is a great place to throw our money into because they've been issuing government bonds for more than a century. But according to the American Bondholders Foundation, there have been a few small problems in the past for investors who've bought Chinese debt. Small problems like not ever getting paid back. Matt Gnaizda sat down with Jonna Bianco, president of the American Bondholders Foundation, to learn more.
Thanks for joining me, Jonna.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Now, you're an expert on Chinese bonds, which is good because they're really hot right now. In fact, a few weeks ago, the Chinese government raised $6 billion in a huge international sale of its sovereign bonds. So my question is, how much should I be investing in these Chinese bonds?
Well, look, when it comes to China, history has a tendency to repeat itself. I represent 20,000 U.S. citizens holding defaulted Chinese sovereign debt that they defaulted on, refused to pay, although paid Great Britain. So as we know, history does repeat itself. Your money gets tied up, they default. You have nowhere to go to collect it with China other than your government. And we have seen nothing but game playing in politics when it comes to China, especially with Beijing, Biden, and the Democrats. I mean, we've seen that with the election. We've seen it with our national security. We've seen it with the continued ignoring of the most existential threat we've ever seen facing this country, which is China.
I mean, so you're suggesting that maybe we shouldn't trust the Chinese Communist Party? I mean, what have they ever lied about?
I think that the list would be shorter to say what haven't they told the truth about. In all honesty, we cannot trust China. Look, we see President Donald Trump speaking about it. We see DNI Ratcliffe. We see Secretary Pompeo. Everybody is saying China is the most existential threat facing this country. And yet it continues to fall on deaf ears with our politicians on both sides of the aisle. They know of this threat. I mean, gosh, look at this. It took 10 years for the Senate with under McConnell's leadership to get a bill to the Senate floor and a vote just to make China and their state-owned enterprises comply with the very same rules and regulations that every other company trading on Wall Street from around the world has to comply with. There's no disclosure. There's no information available to the investor. China hides behind state secrets. And so it took 10 years just to get that bill to the floor. And in that vote, they agreed, let's give them 3 years to come into compliance with SEC rules and regulations to audit their books. So investors know where their money's actually going. Well, I can tell you where it's going. It's going for nefarious reasons, as we've seen with the military buildup in the South China Seas, their technology information stealing. The list is a mile long. And so investing in China is very, very dangerous, and there is no control. We've seen the same thing in the House. I see nothing but political rhetoric pandering to Wall Street and the big Chinese contributions and donors that fill their pockets, and yet nothing is ever done at the peril of the citizens of the United States and those around the world.
Well, and this kind of ties back into sort of what you're working on, because you're the president of the American Bondholders Foundation. And back in 1912, so more than 100 years ago, after the fall of the Qing dynasty, the Republic of China government issued a huge tranche of debt to build their new republic. I think it was about 25 million pounds of debt, British pounds. So that's like $4 billion US dollars in today's money, right?
Right. And they did that in 12, 13, 14, all the way up through 1938. And then they went into big default. And then the U.S. government, because they were then an ally in the war, allowed them to borrow U.S. Taxpayers' dollars, to which they still never paid back. And then we had the communist regime of the Chinese Communist Party that came in and took over. And other than being held to account by Margaret Thatcher in 1987 to pay back this debt, these bonds to their citizens. No one else has told China, you have to pay your debt. You have to pay your bonds.
So let's talk about these bonds specifically. So the debt that they'd been issuing in the first half of the 20th century, who bought these bonds?
These are, banks bought these bonds. I mean, these bonds were sold around the world. The French, the Belgians, all over the place. They were advertised in the New York Times, sold through Wall Street firms in New York, American citizens, a lot of military people, because it was promoted to military people to help support our then ally in the war, to purchase these bonds. And then China defaulted, the communist regime came in, and then now refused to pay. Keep in mind, governments issue long-term debt, 30, 40, 50, 60-year-long bonds. In fact, China is issuing 100-year bonds in Europe as we speak. And look, sovereign debt does not expire. It's important to note that during World War II, which was in the 1940s, Great Britain borrowed back then like $21 billion from America. It was only December 31st of 2006 that they made their last and final payment, paying off that debt of sovereign debt owed to America, which was, from taxpayers' dollars. So again, sovereign debt does not expire. Government debt does not expire. It would be no different than somebody who bought a 30-year Treasury bond today, 20 years from now, under a different administration, says, oh gosh, that was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that's old. We shouldn't have to pay that now, move on. Just move along and don't get your money. And that's basically what we see. It's a big bully dealing with China and their political allies on Wall Street and corporate America, who sold out middle class to profit themselves and put Americans out of work, out of manufacturing. The middle to low income individual was just out of a job, and it all went to China. And we see the results of that, just like we saw during this pandemic, of not being able to get pharmaceutical supplies, PPE equipment, so on and so forth. And so the only people that profited from that is your senior executives in these Wall Street firms. And unfortunately, with all of the thousands of state-owned enterprises that China has trading on our markets, that unwitting American citizens through their retirements, 401ks, pensions, are being invested in China. And it's not going to be too much longer, as we've seen the massive amounts of default go on in businesses in China, that they're going to default again. And those people are going to lose their pensions, their 401ks, their retirement, and have nothing left.
And that's a really good point. But I want to talk a bit about the continuity of these long-term bonds that were issued, 100 years ago. I mean, look, I don't want to be held responsible for things I did 20 years ago, but I understand that for governments it's different. However, comparing what happened in China to getting a new U.S. president maybe isn't the best analogy, because in 1949, the People's Republic of China took over from the Republic of China, right? And now the Republic of China government that had issued those bonds is now basically what we call the government of Taiwan, right? So why should the People's Republic of China have to pay the debt issued by the previous government that occupied that region?
Because they occupy and control the infrastructure that these funds were used to create. To this moment, they're still collecting the SALT tax that was used to underwrite these bonds. It's called successor government doctrine. Basically, the current government is responsible for the debts and obligations of the former government. Look, and China mandates a one China policy, not recognizing Taiwan, as we very well know. I'm quite confident that the Republic of China, in fact, they passed it in their constitution under Article 63 just not too many years ago, that when they become the real China again, they're more than happy and are recognized as such. They're more than happy to pay their financial debts and obligations. In the meantime, they're under the control, under a one China policy of Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party. And under law, international law, U.S. law, successor government doctrine prevails. And there's precedent. Look, Margaret Thatcher recognized this, and in 1987 made it clear to the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party, you're not going to issue more bonds on our soil, taking more money from our citizens until you start paying the bonds and the defaulted debt that you already owe. And so, in fact, the Chinese Communist Party, the PRC, did in fact pay Great Britain for the very same bonds that American citizens are holding, the French, the Belgians, and many others around the world.
Wait, so the Chinese Communist Party recognized the validity of the debt and paid it back, but only to the British investors and not to the American investors or bondholders. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct. And it's because no American administration, no president has said to China, you have to pay your debts to the American people. I mean, we hear during election time on both sides of the aisle, of course, until this recent one, we have to hold China accountable. We're going to be tough on China. President Trump ran in 2016 on holding China to account and in fact made it clear that, we are where we are with China, not because that he blamed China, but he blamed former administrations for not being tough on China and making them play by the same rules that the rest of the world played by, especially when it comes to trade. Until President Donald J. Trump came around, no previous administration would hold China accountable. They wouldn't make them play by the same rules. Now, Donald Trump says he's going to make China pay. He's going to hold them accountable. And on behalf of the American Bondholders Foundation, we do believe he's a promises made, promises kept president. I have met with him. He has assured me faithfully that he would resolve this issue, but the clock is ticking, and Americans are suffering at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party and their plague. And this, we're paying $72 million a day of our tax dollars going to China for Chinese-held U.S. treasuries. Why can that money not go to the American people that are suffering because of the Chinese plague? And so we're now calling upon President Trump to uphold your word, your promises that you have made. Let's keep those promises, and let's actually do something and be tough on China and hold them accountable versus just political rhetoric that we see from all of these various politicians.
Right. So you guys actually have a very specific proposal to essentially force the Chinese Communist Party to pay back that debt to U.S. bondholders. What is that proposal?
Well, it's actually in the law. It's something that Congress passed long ago. Basically, at the president's request, the Treasury Secretary can bring in the bonds held by the American citizens here, over 20,000 families in 46 states, and they can use those bonds to extinguish the debt that America owes to China. So basically, you're basically swapping paper for paper.
Basically, what you're saying is that the U.S. Treasury buys the Chinese bonds from American bondholders, and then the U.S. debt that the Chinese government holds, the U.S. Treasury doesn't pay China back in American dollars. Instead, we pay China back with its own debt. Am I getting that right?
That is correct. That is correct, which will save hundreds of billions of dollars to the American people. Because, I mean, look, the American Bondholders Foundation and typical debt settlements to this capacity, this isn't new. There's been 47 previous bond settlements of defaulted debt in this country through the Foreign Bondholders Protective Council, which was established in 1934 under President Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull. So what we propose is not anything new. It just needs to have the political willpower and the backbone to stand against the communist regime and hold them accountable. This would be actually debt settlement number 48. And so typical settlements are done at pennies on the dollar, however, utilized at full value to extinguish debt under a debt offset owed, to that foreign entity. So this isn't anything uncommon. This isn't anything new. It's already in the law. It just needs to be upheld and enforced.
What's the total amount of Chinese government debt from this, 20th century tranche of debt? What's the total amount held by Americans, and what's the total value that you think could be gotten back by these bondholders?
Well, right now, of course, you have accrued interest, and these are gold bonds, so it's based on the current market value of gold. We're holding nearly $2 trillion worth of these bonds, based on how courts have ruled on, time value, loss of money, et cetera, by the experts. And so China is currently holding approximately $1.1 trillion in U.S. treasuries. And so, which is why we're paying $72 million a day of taxpayers' dollars that are going to China. So if you took in these bonds and you paid out a small fraction of that, a very, very, I'm talking literally pennies, like under a nickel on the dollar kind of thing, to the American bondholders that hold these. You could extinguish hundreds of billions of dollars of debt to China, that they use those funds to buy up America, as we've seen, and also for nefarious reasons around the world. So it would be a huge benefit savings to the American people. It would also help put China in check. It would hold them accountable. And in fact, these very same funds could be used as a stimulus to the American people that have lost their jobs, are losing their homes, can't feed their families as a result of the Chinese plague that we have seen bestowed upon this country.
So the American bondholders under this proposal themselves would maybe only get a nickel back on every dollar that they were originally owed, but overall you're saying that American taxpayers would save in addition to that because it would reduce the amount that the U.S. has to pay back in U.S. Treasury debt. Okay.
That is correct.
So one of the interesting things here that you point out is that the law that gives the U.S. government the tools to do this is already in place, but it's not really a question of the law at this point. It's a question of political willpower, right? And
that is correct.
And you have met with Trump, but so far in 4 years, the Trump administration has not actually done this.
Well, President Trump sent it to Secretary Mnuchin, and that's the problem. He doesn't want to do anything to rock the boat with the Chinese, and so he keeps pushing the issue off. President Trump would like to see this done and is committed to seeing this done and getting resolved, and it keeps being sent to Secretary Mnuchin, who pushes it off and does not want to do anything to rock the boat with China. That's evident. I mean, he is Mr. China. He's making decisions that is in China's best interest, not in the interest of the American people.
So if Joe Biden becomes the next president, and I recognize that's by no means certain because obviously this is 2020, and you never know, right? But if Joe Biden does become president, how do you think he and his Treasury Secretary, possibly Janet Yellen, would handle this?
I don't think they would. I mean, we are talking Beijing Biden here, okay? So I don't see any support whatsoever coming from the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, prior to President Trump coming into office, there's been multiple resolutions out of the House and the Senate on this issue, bipartisan. It was always a bipartisan issue until President Trump was elected president. And now, have you heard one Democrat condemn China for their handling of the COVID-19? Have you heard one Democrat condemn China for their spying in our country through their Confucius Institute? Have you heard one Democrat condemn China for anything whatsoever? You will not hear it because they're working in collusion with the Chinese Communist Party to take down President Trump, to turn our country into a socialistic, communistic country and turn it upside down and destroy the American freedoms that we have. So to get justice under a Beijing Biden administration, I think not.
And, I understand your criticism of the Democrats. I would like to point out that a number of Democratic senators and congresspeople have supported the Hong Kong Human Rights Act and the Uyghur Freedom Act. I forget the actual name. Nancy Pelosi has been outspoken about the Tiananmen Square massacre. And some of the stuff that we've seen is bipartisan support for Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. Now, you're right that you haven't seen bipartisan support over the COVID-19.
I agree with you. They have spoke out in that regard. But what actions did they actually take to punish China, to go after China, to hold China accountable? So all of those things, why I think it's great that they spoke out and condemned it. But again, political rhetoric. We need action, action, action. And that is not what we are seeing.
Well, I think there's maybe some good news here because the Hong Kong Freedom and Democracy Act did give the president essentially the tools to sanction specific individuals for their abuses in Hong Kong. You had bipartisan legislation, and then you had the Trump administration actually activate it, so to speak.
But tell me, in sanctioning those people, in sanctioning those handful of people, please tell me how that affects the rest of Hong Kong and their citizenry and their freedoms, or the Uyghurs. It does not. Tell me how that puts food on the tables of the American people who have lost their jobs because of the Chinese Communist Party and COVID-19. The same with the travel ban. While I think the tools that they're using and the actions that have been taken thus far have been so minuscule in the grand scheme of things that it makes it appear that they're doing something. But to what benefit did that help the Uyghurs? To what benefit did that help the freedom of the Hong Kong people? To what benefit did blocking travel or sanctioning a handful of Chinese Communist Party leadership, what benefit was that to the millions of American people that have lost their jobs, or the hundreds of thousands that have died as a result of COVID-19 and the Chinese Communist Party plague?
Well, you're absolutely right. The benefit to those policies is really that it disincentivizes Chinese officials from committing further abuses. I mean, whether it's effective or not, I think it's hard to say so far. But what it does show is that there is some ability of Congress to come together from both sides of the aisle and take some action on China. And the action that you're proposing needs to happen with through the American Bondholders Foundation. There's already the law, but it still requires probably more bipartisan political willpower.
Actually, it only takes a national security presidential memorandum, not even an executive order. It's a national security presidential memorandum from President Trump to his Secretary of Treasury, instructing him to follow the process legalities that we just mentioned and complete this transaction in holding China accountable. So it doesn't require congressional involvement or approval. The laws are already in place. It actually takes the backbone of President Donald J. Trump in actually holding China accountable to the American people, to the bondholders, to the citizens of the U.S., in actually holding China accountable. So an NSPM is basically all it takes.
So given that even under the Trump administration, Secretary Mnuchin has not done this, and also given that the next president might be Joe Biden, what advice would you have for the American people who are watching this show? It's something that they can do to possibly push this along.
I recommend they contact the White House and urge President Donald J. Trump to sign the National Security Presidential Memorandum and actually hold China accountable to not only pay the bondholders, but to do the debt offset and utilize those funds as an economic stimulus across America to help those that are struggling as a result of the Chinese Communist Party plague bestowed upon the American people. This is money that China owes. It's that they haven't paid. So collect that debt, let it benefit the American people and the bondholders, and actually hold China accountable.
Well, I like your advice to have viewers write to the White House, and I think it's a very clever solution to have the U.S. Treasury pay China back for U.S. bonds with China's own debt that they refuse to pay back. So thank you very much for joining me, Jonna.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And thank you for watching. Tell us what you think in the comments below, and let us know if you plan to write to the White House like she suggested. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.